first missions to ever go to the moon.
The name Apollo came from the Director of Research and Associate Director of NASA, Dr. Abe Silverstein. He got the name from when he was reading a mythology book and saw a picture of Apollo riding his chariot across the sun.
The goals of the missions were to establish a technology to meet other national interests in space, to achieve preeminence in space for the U.S., to carry out a program of scientific exploration of the moon, and to further develop man's capability to work in the lunar environment.
To complete all of these different types of goals, NASA separated missions into different letters for their different goals. A was for the 2 unmanned Saturn V launches, B was for the first development of the lunar module, C was for the first manned CSM, C prime, which is between C and D, was for practice procedures for a lunar flight, D was for the first manned development LM flight, E was for the elliptical medium Earth orbit test, which was canceled. F is for Apollo 10, and J is for when they used the extended lunar module.
Overall, NASA went up to Apollo 17 with all of these different types of missions, but there are actually only 12 missions that are officially part of the Apollo missions. These include Apollo 1, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17.
That means that the missions that were skipped were missions 2 through 6. The Apollo missions 4 through 6 did happen, but they aren't officially listed because they were unmanned. As for Apollo 2 and 3, they never happened. Their crews were picked and already training, but their missions were canceled after the tragedy of Apollo 1.
Apollo 1 was the first of the space-exploring missions, and it was by far the worst. On January 27, 1967, the crew of Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Robert Chaffee were testing on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy when there was a flash fire in their cabin. All 3 of the astronauts died from the fire.
This tragedy postponed missions for 21 months. The next manned mission, which would be the first Saturn V launch, was Apollo 4.
Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. Therefore, I ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Apollo 11 was the famous mission in which we landed the first man, Neil Armstrong, on the moon. During his 2.5 hours on the moon, he said the famous quote,
"One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
He also placed the American flag on the lunar surface, and he collected samples with his crew member Buzz Aldrin. Their primary goal was to complete the national goal of landing people on the moon and coming home.
The next most famous mission was Apollo 13. Apollo 13's main objective was to further the information gathered by the crew of Apollo 11. However, due to an explosion preventing them from landing, they had to instead circle the moon, and their mission was now passed to Apollo 14.
About 5 minutes into Apollo 13's mission, they felt a vibration which was caused by the center engine shutting down. This shutdown caused the other engines to burn 34 to 43 seconds longer than they were supposed to, so they could enter Earth's orbit. This also caused other problems to arise. The number 2 oxygen tank dropped to 92%. Eventually, the crew thought the problem resolved itself until they realized the tank was not emptying properly. To get rid of the excess oxygen, they put an intense heater near the tank. This worked, but it took 8 hours, which caused the internal heating elements of the tank to be severely damaged.
Aside from these few relatively minor problems, Apollo 13 was beginning to look like the smoothest mission yet. So smooth, in fact, that one crew member said they were bored to tears. Only 9 hours later, however, oxygen tank number 2 suddenly blew up, causing number 1 to fail. The command module lost all its normal supply of water, light, and electricity, and they were more than 200,000 miles from Earth. This is when Jack Swingert made the famous
Houston, we've had a problem.
With warning lights blinking, one oxygen tank appeared to be completely empty, and there were indications that the oxygen in the second tank was rapidly depleting. 13 minutes after the explosion, Lovell, another crew member, happened to look out of the left-hand window and saw the final evidence pointing toward the potential catastrophe.
It was oxygen gas escaping at high rate from the second and last oxygen tank. In an effort to save their lives, the crew decided to use the LM lifeboat, while 2 of the crew members quickly floated through the shuttle. One stayed to make sure that they would have enough supplies to make it home. This crew member found multiple problems that could potentially arise, such as a shortage in the food supply, which was made for only 45 hours, and they need 90, power level, and carbon dioxide emission abilities.
After about a day and a half aboard the LM, the carbon dioxide reached a dangerous level. To fix this problem, the crew used cardboard, plastic bags, and duct tape.
The last mission in the series, Apollo 17, was the final mission of the J-type series. On December 7, 1972, at 12:33 a.m. Eastern Time, Apollo 17 and its crew launched for the last Apollo mission. The objectives of this mission were to take a geological survey, sample kinds of materials and surface features in a pre-selected region, and conduct in-flight experiment and photographic tasks during lunar orbit, all of which they achieved. They landed in the Pacific Ocean, and the last Apollo crew returned safely home.
The end of these missions were symbolized by the 2 new programs who used the leftover Apollo rockets. These were the Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz test projects. All of the Apollo missions took great leaps for mankind.
They landed men on the moon and made everlasting advancements on space shuttles, spacesuits, and other space technologies.
Most importantly, they gathered information that would help shape the world into what it is today.